Healing did not make you softer. That is the lie most people were taught. You thought healing would turn you into someone more patient, more available, more forgiving, more willing to understand everyone around you. But something else happened instead. You became quieter, harder to guilt, harder to control, harder to emotionally manipulate. Not because you became cruel, because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. The strange thing is, people noticed immediately. The same people who once called you kind started calling you cold. The same people who depended on your emotional availability suddenly felt uncomfortable around your silence. And for the first time in your life, you stopped rushing to fix that discomfort. Because healing did not remove your sensitivity. It removed your unconsciousness. You started noticing how often your nervous system had been forced to carry emotions that never belonged to you. How many relationships survived only because you kept betraying your own instincts? How many times your body whispered, leave, while your conditioning whispered, stay? Carl Jung understood something most modern self-help refuses to admit. A healed empath does not become endlessly open. They become differentiated, aware, disciplined, difficult to manipulate, not through aggression, through clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because once you can clearly see manipulation, you can no longer participate in it the same way. Once you can clearly feel your own exhaustion, you stop volunteering your soul to people who consume it. Once you stop confusing self-sacrifice with love, your entire identity begins to shift. That shift is what terrifies unconscious people, because the healed version of you no longer absorbs chaos just to keep the peace. It observes, and sometimes it quietly walks away. Tonight, we're going to talk about what really happens when an empath heals. Not the soft fantasy version, the real transformation, the one that changes the way you love, the way you speak, the way you protect your energy, and the way you disappear from people who only knew how to access you through guilt. Long before you became emotionally exhausted, you became emotionally alert. You learned very early that survival depended on observation, the sound of footsteps in another room, the shift in someone's breathing, the silence after a slammed door, the tension hiding underneath polite conversations. Other children learned how to play freely. You learned how to scan. You learned how to read the emotional weather of a room before speaking. You learned how to predict moods before they exploded. You learned how to become emotionally useful. And because of that, people called you mature. But what they called maturity was often hypervigilance, a nervous system trained to stay alert because unpredictability had consequences. Maybe love in your environment felt conditional. Maybe peace disappeared without warning. Maybe someone around you carried unresolved anger, addiction, instability, or emotional absence. So your psyche adapted. You became sensitive to everything. You noticed what other people ignored, the sadness hidden behind smiles, the resentment hidden inside kindness, the exhaustion hidden behind responsibility. Over time, this sensitivity became your identity. You became the listener, the calm one, the understanding one, the emotional caretaker. And slowly, you stopped existing as a person with needs of your own. You existed as emotional support for everyone else. Carl Jung described this as unconscious participation, the inability to separate your emotional reality from the emotional reality of those around you. You walked into rooms and absorbed tension as if it belonged to you. You carried grief that was never yours. You felt responsible for emotions you did not create. And because you were deeply empathetic, you believed carrying all of that made you loving. But love without boundaries becomes self-erasure. You said yes when your body wanted rest. You stayed quiet when something inside you felt unsafe. You tolerated emotional inconsistency because you feared abandonment more than exhaustion. The painful part is this. Most empaths do not realize they are abandoning themselves because self-abandonment often disguises itself as compassion. You tell yourself you are being patient, understanding, loyal, supportive, but beneath that, your nervous system is collapsing under emotional overload. And after years of carrying everyone else, something strange begins to happen. You lose contact with yourself. You know exactly how other people feel, but you no longer know how you feel. You can sense tension in everyone around you, but cannot identify your own resentment until it becomes burnout. You become emotionally intelligent outwardly, while emotionally disconnected inwardly. That is the tragedy of the unhealed empath. Not sensitivity itself, but sensitivity without protection. A heart that can feel everything without knowing what should and should not be allowed inside. There comes a point where empathy stops feeling beautiful and starts feeling heavy. You begin noticing that the people who need you the most rarely ask how you are doing. You become the emotional container for relationships that would collapse without your patience. You absorb tension, explain away disrespect, excuse inconsistency, translate bad behavior into hidden pain, because part of you believes if you understand someone deeply enough, you can finally love them into becoming safe. But that is not love. That is survival conditioning. The unhealed empath often believes connection must be earned through endurance. So you tolerate what drains you. You normalize emotional confusion. You override your instincts repeatedly. And every time you do, your body keeps score. The exhaustion becomes physical. Sleep no longer restores you. Silence feels necessary. Social interaction begins to feel invasive. You start disappearing emotionally long before you disappear physically. And still, you continue giving. Because saying no feels selfish. Boundaries feel dangerous. Distance feels cruel. So instead of protecting yourself, you negotiate with your own pain. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it. They're struggling. They had a hard life. And maybe all of that is true. But eventually, one realization changes everything. Someone can be wounded and still wound you. Someone can suffer and still manipulate you. Someone can need help and still consume your soul in the process. This is the moment where many empaths begin waking up. Not through inspiration, through exhaustion, through betrayal, through the horrifying realization that empathy without discernment attracts people who benefit from your self-sacrifice. And suddenly, you start replaying years of your life differently. The relationships, the conversations, the guilt, the emotional labor. You begin seeing how often you betrayed yourself just to preserve connection. That realization hurts deeply because the empath does not only grieve other people, they grieve the version of themselves that tolerated so much for so long. Most people do not enter individuation willingly. They are pushed into it by pain. For the empath, that pain usually arrives through betrayal, not small disappointment. A betrayal that shatters your operating system. Usually it comes from the person you defended the most, the person you protected, the person you believed truly saw your heart. And then one day, you finally see clearly. You realize they were taking far more than they were giving. You realize your empathy had become access. Your patience had become permission. Your understanding had become a resource they learned how to use. And suddenly, everything changes. Not loudly, quietly. You stop explaining their behavior. You stop negotiating with your intuition. You stop forcing your body to tolerate what your soul already rejected. At first, this awakening feels cold because you spent your entire life believing love meant staying emotionally available no matter the cost. So when clarity finally arrives, it feels almost frightening. You notice how manipulation actually works, how guilt is used, how inconsistency creates emotional dependency, how some people survive by keeping others emotionally confused, and for the first time, you stop participating. This is where the shadow appears, not as violence, as suppressed truth. Your anger, your refusal, your exhaustion, your desire to leave, all the emotions you once labeled selfish begin returning to consciousness. Carl Jung believed healing required shadow integration, meaning you cannot become whole while rejecting your capacity for boundaries, aggression, or severance. The empath fears these qualities because they associate them with cruelty. But there is a difference between cruelty and self-protection. Cruelty harms others for power. Self-protection refuses further self-destruction. And eventually, you reach a breaking point. Not emotional chaos, clarity. A moment where you finally understand. Every time you ignored your instincts to protect someone else's comfort, you committed violence against yourself. That realization changes the way you love forever. Because after seeing the truth clearly, you can never fully return to unconsciousness again. Healing changes your energy long before it changes your life externally. People begin feeling something different around you. Not anger, distance, calm distance. You no longer absorb emotional projections automatically. You no longer rush to defend yourself. You no longer panic when someone becomes disappointed. Because your nervous system is finally learning differentiation, you begin understanding their emotions are not always your responsibility. And this realization is revolutionary for the empath. Someone becomes upset. Previously, you would internalize it immediately. You would search yourself for mistakes, apologize too quickly, over-explain, over-function. Now, you observe. You notice patterns instead of absorbing them. You notice how certain people create emotional chaos whenever boundaries appear. You notice how guilt disappears when it no longer finds a target. You notice how manipulation loses power once it becomes visible. This is why healing unsettles people who benefited from your unconsciousness. Because your energy no longer says, I will carry this for you. It says, you must face yourself. And many people cannot tolerate that. So they accuse you of changing. They say you became distant, hard, different. But they are not reacting to cruelty. They are reacting to the loss of access. The healed empath is no longer emotionally available to every demand, crisis, projection, or performance. And because of that, your peace slowly returns. Not dramatic happiness, something deeper, internal quiet. You stop chasing closure, stop forcing conversations, stop begging people to understand your intentions. You begin trusting silence. You begin trusting your body again. And for perhaps the first time in your life, you realize calm is more valuable than approval. One of the biggest misunderstandings about healing is this. People think boundaries make you closed. But real boundaries do not close the heart, they protect it. The healed empath does not become emotionally unavailable. They become selective. You stop giving unlimited access to people who repeatedly disrespect your nervous system. You stop confusing proximity with intimacy. You stop mistaking emotional intensity for genuine connection. And this changes your entire relational world. You begin paying attention to patterns instead of promises. Who respects your limits without punishment? Who only contacts you when they need emotional regulation? Who becomes uncomfortable when you stop over-giving? The answers become obvious once you stop abandoning yourself. And slowly, your definition of kindness changes. Before healing, kindness meant tolerance, patience, self-sacrifice, emotional endurance. After healing, kindness becomes clarity, honesty, discernment, and self-respect. You realize being nice often meant suppressing truth to avoid conflict. But authentic kindness sometimes disappoints people. Sometimes it says no. Sometimes it walks away. Sometimes it refuses to rescue. This is why healed empaths often become quieter, not because they care less, because they finally understand where their energy actually belongs. They stop pouring themselves into relationships built entirely on extraction. They stop performing emotional labor for people committed to staying unconscious. And instead, they reserve their presence for reciprocal relationships. Relationships where emotional safety exists naturally, where boundaries are respected, where honesty does not require emotional punishment. The healed empath still loves deeply, but no longer at the cost of themselves. That is the difference. Love is no longer self-erasure. It becomes conscious choice. Something profound happens once sensitivity combines with boundaries. Your perception sharpens. You begin recognizing manipulation almost instantly. Not because you became paranoid, because your intuition is no longer buried beneath guilt. You notice inconsistencies faster. You notice emotional performances faster. You notice who drained your nervous system immediately. And perhaps the strangest part of healing is this. You begin trusting what you feel without needing endless external validation. The old version of you constantly doubted itself, needed proof, needed reassurance, needed permission to leave. The healed version observes and acts accordingly, quietly, without drama. This creates a kind of power most people do not understand. Not domination, not intimidation. Psychological sovereignty. The ability to remain emotionally grounded in environments that once consumed you. Carl Jung believed individuation meant integrating both light and shadow, compassion and discernment, sensitivity and strength, openness and boundaries. The healed empath becomes capable of all of them simultaneously. You can love deeply without losing yourself. You can understand people without excusing their behavior. You can recognize suffering without volunteering to be destroyed by it. And this transformation changes every system around you. Family dynamics shift. Toxic relationships collapse. People who depended on your emotional compliance become uncomfortable. Some leave, some attack you, some attempt to guilt you back into your previous role, but something inside you has already changed too deeply. You no longer fear disappointing people the way you once did, because peace became more important than performance. And eventually, you stop seeing your sensitivity as a weakness. You understand what it really was. A highly developed awareness, waiting for wisdom. Not something to suppress, something to protect consciously. Healing did not turn you into someone colder. It turned you into someone conscious. Someone who finally understands that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is necessary. You were never meant to carry every wounded person you encountered. You were never meant to sacrifice your nervous system just to keep relationships alive. You were never meant to abandon yourself in the name of love. The healed version of you understands this now. That is why your silence feels different, why your boundaries feel stronger, why your energy no longer reaches for people who repeatedly drain it. You are not becoming cruel. You're becoming whole. And wholeness changes the way you move through this world. You stop chasing, stop proving, stop over-explaining. You simply observe clearly and choose peace accordingly. Some people will not understand this transformation. They only knew the version of you that tolerated everything. Let them misunderstand. Because the person you are becoming is no longer built around emotional survival. You are built around truth, and truth is quiet. If something inside you has been changing lately, if you can feel yourself becoming calmer, more selective, more protective of your inner world, stay close. This channel was made for people learning how to stop abandoning themselves. Sleep well and come back to yourself.